The Roman Colosseum, a place of roaring crowds, blinding sunlight, and the clash of steel on steel. To the spectators, it was the ultimate entertainment, a living drama of courage, skill, and bloodshed. Gladiators were the heroes of this savage stage, men who fought for glory, survival, and sometimes freedom. But behind the spectacle lay a much darker truth, one that the cheering masses never saw. When the games began, the air was filled with excitement. The audience came expecting to witness bravery and honor. What they didn't realize was that many of the gladiators stepping onto that arena floor were already walking toward certain death. The rules of the games were brutal, and mercy was a rare gift. Even if a gladiator fought well, one wrong move could seal his fate, and the arena had many ways to make that fate as horrifying as possible. The first and most feared death was the execution fight. If a gladiator was deemed unworthy, perhaps he had lost too many battles or displeased the crowd, he could be paired against a heavily armed opponent in a match designed for him to lose. These bouts weren't about skill. They were public punishments. The doomed fighter was often given a blunt weapon or none at all, ensuring that his end would be quick, bloody, and humiliating. Another cruel fate came in the form of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. To the crowd, this was thrilling, but to the condemned, it was sheer terror. Gladiators marked for this fate were sent into the arena with wild animals, lions, leopards, or even bears, without the proper armor or weapons to defend themselves. The animals were often starved beforehand, making them even more vicious. In some cases, the gladiators' hands were tied to ensure there was no real fight, only a slow and horrifying end. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Some gladiators were forced to reenact famous historical executions for the crowd's amusement. They would dress the condemned in costumes and recreate scenes from myths or past battles, except the weapons were real, and the deaths were final. One recorded example tells of a man dressed as Orpheus who was attacked by a trained bear mid-performance while the audience laughed and applauded, and then there was the punishment of the spoliarium. After a gladiator fell, wounded but not yet dead, attendants known as libetiniarii would drag his body to the underground chambers beneath the arena. If he was still breathing, his fate was sealed. In the dark, away from the cheering crowd, his throat would be slit to ensure he never rose again. No one watching from the stands knew what happened in those shadowy corridors, only that their favorite had been carried away and would not return. The games were not always fair contests of strength. Sometimes they were political tools, used to send a message. A rebellious slave forced into the arena might be given impossible odds as a warning to others. A soldier accused of desertion might face his execution in front of the army as both punishment and entertainment. For the Romans, these deaths weren't just sport. They were displays of power, control, and the price of defiance. For the gladiators, survival depended on skill, luck, and the favor of the crowd. But even the most skilled fighter could meet a brutal end. One of the most chilling realities was that the decision to spare or kill a gladiator rested on the whim of the editor, the sponsor of the games, and the mood of the audience. If the crowd shouted for death, the editor would usually comply, raising his thumb in the fateful signal. And just like that, a man's fate was decided not by his own actions, but by the bloodlust of strangers. This was the part of the games the Roman people loved to forget. That beneath the cheers, there was suffering. Beneath the sand, there was blood. And for every gladiator who walked out alive, there were many whose stories ended in ways too cruel for even the arena to proudly display. But what happened to the bodies after the games ended? And what were the most gruesome secret deaths that the crowds were never meant to witness? That's where the hidden side of the gladiator's world becomes even darker. When the last cheer faded and the gates of the Colosseum closed for the night, the grandeur of the games disappeared like smoke in the wind. The crowd went home satisfied, but for the gladiators left on the arena floor. The show wasn't over. Their final act was just beginning. The golden sunlight that once lit the battles was gone, replaced by flickering torches casting long, cruel shadows across the sand. Those who had fallen in combat were motionless, their armor dented, their weapons scattered. Some were dead, others clung desperately to life, their shallow breaths barely audible over the echo of footsteps approaching. From the edge of the arena, the libetiniarii, attendants whose job was to deal with the dead, moved in with cold precision. They inspected each fallen man, deciding within moments who was beyond saving and who might be worth the cost of medical care. Gladiators who were too injured to fight again were rarely spared. The Colosseum was not a hospital, it was a business. And in Rome, a gladiator who couldn't fight was a liability, those deemed unfit to return. To the sands were taken to the hypogeum, the underground chambers, where their fate was sealed away from the public eye. The hypogeum was a labyrinth beneath the arena, filled with the smell of damp stone, blood, and sweat. This was where animals were kept before fights, where prisoners waited for their executions, and where the wounded were carried if the editor, the sponsor of the games, decided they would not live to fight again. In these dark corridors, there was no cheering crowd, no honor, only silence broken by the sound of a blade delivering a final blow. The Romans liked their games spectacular, but they preferred their messy endings hidden below the ground. Some punishments were so humiliating or cruel that they were never meant to be seen by the public. Gladiators who tried to escape the games could face beatings so severe that death came slowly over hours. Others, accused of cowardice or refusing to fight, might be stripped of their armor and tied to wooden posts where fellow fighters practiced lethal strikes on them, a brutal training exercise and a warning to others. These deaths were not about entertainment, they were about control. Occasionally, the punishment was designed as a message. The crucifixio arenalis, crucifixion in the arena, was rare but unforgettable. Condemned men would be tied to crosses erected on the sand, while wild animals were released to attack them. If the spectacle took too long, an executioner would end it quickly with a spear thrust. Though the crowd might cheer, this was as much political theater as it was sport, a show of Rome's absolute power over life and death. Even more unsettling were the starvation punishments. Gladiators who defied orders could be locked in underground cells without food or water for days, then forced into combat while weakened and barely able to stand. The crowd thought they were watching a hopelessly outmatched fighter. In reality, they were witnessing the slow, deliberate breaking of a man's body and spirit. One of the most chilling tales from the Colosseum is that of Marcus Felix, a celebrated veteran who had fought for over a decade. Known for his unmatched swordsmanship, he had survived injuries and outlived rivals who were younger and stronger. But his fortune turned when he refused to fight in a match he believed was dishonorable. The editor, angered by his defiance, arranged a final spectacle. Marcus would face 3 opponents at once. The crowd cheered at the sight of the legendary warrior against impossible odds, unaware that the fight had been rigged. Marcus fought with all the strength and skill that had made him famous, but each wound was inflicted slowly, almost ceremonially, to prolong his suffering. When he finally collapsed, the sand beneath him darkened with blood. His body was left on the arena floor longer than any other that day, a silent warning to every gladiator watching from the holding cells. Not all brutal deaths were the result of punishment. Sometimes they came from the sheer unpredictability of the arena. Animals meant to fight other beasts would turn on their handlers. Machinery used to raise platforms from the hypogeum would malfunction, crushing those trapped below. A sudden collapse of a section of the stands could send debris and spectators crashing onto the sands, turning a day of games into chaos. The Romans loved drama, but they never admitted how often the arena claimed lives in ways that had nothing to do with skill or honor. The crowd rarely saw the disposal of the dead. After the games, bodies were stripped of armor and weapons, valuable property that would be reused or sold. The remains were often unceremoniously dumped in mass graves outside the city walls. Only a lucky few, usually those with wealthy patrons, received proper burials. Most gladiators, once their usefulness was gone, were erased from the city's memory as if they had never existed, and yet their stories survived in whispers. In taverns and training schools, fighters spoke quietly of the deaths the crowd never witnessed. The assassinations in the hippodrome, the slow starvation punishments, the executions staged not for spectacle, but for revenge. These were the truths that stripped away the myth of the gladiator as a noble hero and revealed the brutal reality of life and death in the arena. To the people of Rome, the Colosseum was a symbol of power and entertainment. To the gladiators, it was both a stage and a prison, a place where glory could be won but where death was always waiting, sometimes in the open and sometimes in the shadows below. For every fight that ended with cheers and applause, there was another that ended in silence, behind stone walls where no one could hear the final cries. Today, the ruins of the Colosseum stand as a monument to Rome's history. Tourists walk the same sands where gladiators once fought, imagining the roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, the drama of the games. But if the stones could speak, they would tell not only of victories and honor, but of the hidden punishments, the rigged fights, and the cruel deaths that never made it into the public record. The arena's true story is not just one of bravery, but of control, cruelty, and the relentless hunger of an empire that demanded blood for its entertainment. And perhaps, somewhere beneath those ancient ruins, the echoes of the fallen still remain. Not in the cheers above, but in the whispers below, where the brutal deaths of gladiators are remembered, not for the glory they brought, but for the cruelty the arena never wanted the world to see.